Hello good people and welcome back. In this video what we're going to do is start our second unit, which is on futures, markets and central counterparties. You recall in the last unit we said we will be touching on a few derivatives contracts, and we said we're going to be talking about futures, forward, swaps and options. And so in this unit we are essentially going to touch on futures and forward. We will start the discussion with futures and then touch on forward a little later. Well, you remember what a futures contract is from our last unit. A futures contract is an agreement between two parties, so first party and second party enter into an agreement today for a transaction that's going to happen at some point in the future at the price that is defined today, and that price is our forward price or our futures price. In the case of the futures contract, the agreement is exchanged, it's negotiated over an exchange traded market, and therefore there is a middleman that facilitate the transaction. And so the buyer of the underlying is going to take a long position with the exchange, and the exchange is going to take another long position with the seller of the underlying, and so the exchange is going to play the role of the middleman here. The underlying for the transaction can be anything, right? So that underlying can be stocks, bonds, weather, electricity, commodities, corn, oil. It can be anything. So futures contracts are unique in that they are traded on exchange, and the fact that they are traded on exchange requires a degree of standardization to facilitate those transactions. And the standardization comes with specific terms or specifications that are unique to futures contract. Among those specifications we have what can be delivered, be specific about the underlying that we are dealing with here, where it is that it can be delivered, that is that period of time, and where is the location at which the delivery can occur, and when it can be delivered is that period of time, usually a window of time. Now, among the specifications that we have, we typically have, if we want to summarize that, we're going to say we look at the asset that is underlying the transaction, the order is underlying the contract, and we said again that asset can be anything. We have the contract, the contract size, and that contract size could be of the quantity. So let's say contract size, and that contract size could be of any quantity. However, the quantity that is defined by the exchange here, that quantity that is defined by the exchange here, is one that should be accessible to most traders, right? So you don't want to have a standardized contract that has a quantity that is not doable or not accessible to the average trader out there. You want to make the contract size to be of a quantity that makes sense. You also have more the specifications of the contract. Let's say the position limit. The position limit refers to the number of contracts that a speculator can take on any one, the number of positions or contract that the speculator can hold. And the idea here is that derivatives contracts like futures and forward were designed for the purpose of mitigating risk. And so we don't want to allow or financial markets do not want to allow speculator to manipulate prices of futures contract as they wish, or futures prices as they wish, and therefore there are limits to the position that they can take. Now, if you are a hedger, and so this refers to speculators, speculators. If you're a hedger, there is no limit, because the hedger essentially needs the underlying, right? And so if the hedger needs the underlying, they have a vested interest in making sure that not manipulating futures prices. In the manipulation of futures prices goes against the interest of hedgers. So the hedgers have no limit, whereas speculators have a position limit. There is also the daily price movement. And the daily price movement are essentially maximum changes in the value of the position or the contract that that the market is willing to tolerate. Essentially, is to have a little bit more control over over reaction and on the reaction to financial markets, if you will. So the idea here is that we're gonna have limits, and we're gonna have limit up, and we're gonna have limit down. And the limit up would be the maximum change for any specific day that the underlying or the contract can observe during that window. Essentially, the price can fluctuate here, and as soon as it reaches limit up, trading is stopped for that day. And so on the next day, it's going to up and around, up or above or below, for that matter, that limit up from the previous day, and it's going to continue to trade. And if it hits limits down this time, the market is going to close. Okay, so there are limits to changes in the values within the trading period, and typically that trading period is a day. A change is referred to as a limit move, essentially. Now we also have the delivery month. So delivery month, and with respect to the delivery month, we typically refer to the delivery month as the last month of the life. So that is the last month of the life of the contract. That would be our delivery month, the last month of the life of the contract. Well, we're also going to have within that delivery month, the seller or the short party is typically going to be the one dictating if delivery is going to happen and where delivery is going to happen. So the seller or the short party has that unique advantage that they can suggest that. And the way they do that is by suggesting to the exchange or submitting to the exchange what's referred to as an intent to deliver. An intent to deliver. That's intent to deliver. And so once the exchange gets the intent to deliver from the seller or short party, the exchange is then going to match that intent to deliver to a long party. And typically the long party that gets matched with that intent to deliver is the oldest outstanding long position that the exchange has. And so if we have a series of long position, the one that has been outstanding for the longest time on that in the contract of that size, of that in the line with the same specifications, is the one that is going to be taking delivery of the underlying, unless the position was closed before the receipt of this intent to deliver. Let's go back to our slides, and we will continue from there. Well, we also have the characteristics that futures contract are settled daily. And the idea with daily settlement is essentially that the profit and losses from the various positions are essentially realized on a day-to-day basis at what is referred to as the settlement price. And so at the end of every day, every position is going to record whether it recorded or it realized a profit or a loss for the day. And so what we have is, if a position is open, let's say I take a long position in the futures contract today, and the forward price is, let's say, at $40 today, and the contract is expected to mature at some point in the future. Now, at the end of the first trading day, if the forward price is actually, if the price of the underlying is actually, say, $30, if the transaction were to stop on this day, my trader as the long, or myself as the long party, would have to pay the short party $40. And so because I had to pay the short party $40, where the underlying is actually worth 30, I would essentially be losing $10. So it's going to be $10 on the transaction. And so I'll be losing $10 on the transaction, which means that I have to record that loss on this specific day. So the long is going to record a loss of 10, and the short is going to record a profit of 10. That is that mark-to-market principle, and we'll talk some more about that when we refer to when we think about margin later. But the daily settlement is associated with that mark-to-market characteristics of futures contract that says that profit and losses for all positions have to be recorded on a daily basis at the settlement price, which is the closing price on the day. Now there's a futures conversions to the spot characteristics of futures prices. That essentially says that over the life of the contract, the futures price can either be above or below the spot price. That's essentially what we have. But ultimately, at maturity, or as we head towards maturity or expiration of the contract, futures price is essentially going to be equal to the spot price. And what creates that convergence towards the spot price is this idea, or this notion, that arbitrage opportunity may exist. An arbitrage opportunity may exist. And so if the underlying is to be delivered at maturity, its price, or its futures price on the underlying, is going to be forced to converge towards the actual value of the underlying at maturity of the contract. And that's what creates, or that's what forces the futures price to tend towards the spot price as we get closer to maturity or expiration of the contract there. And at any point in time before then, what we can say is that futures price may be higher than the spot price, or futures price may be lower than the spot price. But ultimately, at expiration, futures price are going to be equal or close, very close to spot prices. Now, another characteristics of futures contract is the fact that they require margin. And a margin is a cash or marketable securities, or they are cash or marketable securities that are deposited by investors in his or her broker account. And so what that means is, let's go back to our chart here, is I am an investor and I want to take a long position in a contract, a long position in a futures contract. What I'm going to do, I cannot directly reach out to a short party to do that. That would be considered a forward contract, but forward contract typically involve large financial institutions. So as a retail investor, I may not be able to do that. What I may do, however, is reach out to my broker and say, would you like to do this on my behalf? And the broker would go, yes, why not? However, because you're engaging in a futures contract, you're going to make a deposit with me. And that deposit is what we refer to as the margin. Then I'm going to enter into a long position on your behalf. Now, for the broker to enter into a long or short position on the behalf of the investor, the broker has to be a member of a clearinghouse. Not all brokers are members of a clearinghouse. And so if the broker is not a member of the clearinghouse, the broker is going to reach out to a member, and then the member is going to have a seat on the exchange and enter into the position with the exchange. So the broker would also have a margin account at the members with the member, and the member is going to have an account with the exchange, and this will be our exchange. And so when we refer to when we mention or we talked about the margin here, the margin is this account that that account for that matter that the investor holds with its or her broker, in order to ensure that the transaction, in order to minimize credit risk, right? In order to ensure that the transaction is going to occur at some point in the future. And so what we have is that account will contain cash or marketable securities. And so that is in a form of, that is essentially a form of collateral that the broker, that the investor deposits with the broker. Now the balance in the margin account is going to be adjusted on the daily basis and reflect the daily settlement. And the idea essentially is the following. Let's go back to our chart here, and let's make the assumption that this investor has direct access to the exchange, right? So the investor has direct access to the exchange. That's the assumption that we're making. And so this is what we're going to have. We're going to have an investor here who is going to open an account with the exchange. And the broker is going to say, well, reach out to the exchange and say, I would like to open a long or take a long position in a futures contract on corn, for example. And so the exchange is then going to reach out to another investor who's willing to take the opposite side. And that investor would have to be a member of the exchange, and therefore that investor would have an account here. So as the buyer or the long, what I'm doing is I'm taking a long position with the exchange, and the exchange is taking another long position with another long position with the short party here. So the exchange buys on my behalf, and I'm buying from the exchange. That's essentially what it is. Now, to guarantee, because the exchange is going to happen at some point in the future at time t, to guarantee that this transaction is going to occur, as the seller of the underlying, the seller is required to deposit a collateral, and that collateral is what we refer to as cash or other marketable securities. I myself, as the long party, am also required to deposit with the exchange a collateral, which is an amount of cash. That is a function of the size of the transaction that we're entering into. And so that is what we refer to as our initial margin, the deposit that we make, that we initially make into the transaction. Now, at the end of every day, let's say we enter into the transaction, we had our initial margin, and the transaction was entered into today. At the end of the first day, the futures price has, the price of the underlying has decreased. So the price of the underlying is, let's say the future price is at 40 and the price of the underlying is now 30. What does that mean for the long party? It simply means that the long party will be paying 40 for the underlying and turning around and selling it for 30. So the long party loses 10 at the end of this day. And so the settlement price here would be the 30. That is the price of the underlying at the end of that day, and therefore the long party stands at this point to lose $10. So $10 will be removed or debited from the long party, so that's going to be $10, and credited to the short party. So the short party balance is going to increase by $10. That is what daily settlement is all about. At the end of every day, we look at if the transaction was to end today, who would benefit from the transaction and by how much. And so in this case, the short party would benefit from the transaction, and so the margin account gets adjusted at the end of this day to reflect that change in the position. to reflect the fact that the long party loses $10 and that the short party gains $10. And the same occurs every day. On the next day here, if the transaction, let's say the value of the underlying reduces further to 20, what's going to happen? It ended at 30, and so on the next day it drops some more to 20. So on the next day, the value of the underlying reduced by another 10, right? And so if the value of the underlying reduces by another 10, what does that mean for the long party? And so the long party would be buying at 40. That's because the long party entered into that contract that requires that he or she buys at 40 and then turn around and sell for 20 at the end of the second day. So ultimately, the long party would have lost $20 on this transaction. However, $10 was already recorded on the first day. So only $10 is going to be recorded on the second day, and therefore what we're going to have is another $10 is going to be debited from the long party's margin account and credited into the short party margin account to reflect the position at the end of the second day, and vice versa. And so what we have is the fact that margins minimize the possibility of loss through default on a contract. And what that simply means is that if at the end of the second day, the long party says, well, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm done with this transaction, there is an accounting of the losses that the long party has incurred already over this period. And so that minimizes the risk for the short party. That is the goal. That is the goal here. And so retail traders, just like you and I, will provide a margin, an initial margin. That is what we referred to earlier, that beginning balance that we deposit with our broker. And when the balance in the margin account falls below a maintenance margin level, the retail investor is going to be required to provide variation margin to bring the balance back to the initial margin. Let's go back to our board and see what that simply means. Well, let's say the broker said your balance here cannot go below this threshold, and that threshold here is going to be our maintenance margin. The broker says you have to have this much in your account at all times. That's what you should have in your balance, in your margin account at all times. That's our maintenance margin. Typically, this maintenance margin is 75% of the initial margin. And so the maintenance margin is set. Now, if at the end of every day, we get to record the profit and losses, and it turns out that 5 days into this transaction, this is where my position is, this is where my balance, the balance of my margin account is, because I've incurred a series of losses that have accumulated over time and gotten me below my maintenance margin. The broker is going to initiate what's called a margin call. And the margin call is going to say, put up the difference between what you had in your account, which is the maintenance the initial margin, and what you have left. And so the broker is going to say, bring back, or by the next trading day, I want you to add some money into your margin account and bring your account back to the initial margin. And the amount of money that the long party in this case is going to inject back into the margin account is what is referred to as the variation margin. And so let's go back to our slide here. What we're saying again is that the initial margin, that's the beginning balance, right? And if the balance after the daily settlement, the balance on that margin account falls below what's referred to as the maintenance margin, that's the minimum you should have in your margin account, then you're going to receive a margin call. And that margin call is going to ask that you provide variation margin. And variation margin is the amount of money that you need to add in order to bring back your account to the initial margin level. Now let's look at a quick example of how that works. All right, so in our example, what we have is a retail investor who is taking a long position into December gold futures contract. Well, what that means is sometime in the future, in this case, that's going to be we are today, and in December, we are going to be, because we are taking a long position, we're going to be buying gold. We took long position in gold futures, which means we'll be buying gold in December, and we're buying gold at 8,250. And it's going to be $8,250 per ounce. And our contract size, that is our futures price, $8,250 per ounce. Our contract size is going to be for 100 ounces. And how many contracts do we have? We have 2 contracts, and each contract is for 100 ounces. So we are looking at 200 ounces of gold at 8,250 per ounce. And so we are also told that our initial margin requirement is for $6,000 per contract. And so our initial margin balance is going to be for $6,000 per contract, that we're going to multiply that by the number of contracts that we have, that's by 2. So our initial margin is going to be for $12,000. Now our maintenance margin is typically 75% of the initial margin, and so 75% of 12,000. Let's bring back our financial calculator here. We say, well, if we have 12,000, 1, 2, 3, and we multiply that by 0.75, that's going to give us 9,000. 9,000 is going to be our maintenance margin. The idea here is that our initial margin account is going to be for 12,000. This here is going to be the 12,000, and our account balance cannot go below 9,000, and 9,000 is our maintenance margin. If our balance on our margin account goes below 9,000, we're going to get a margin call, and the margin call, let's say our balance goes to 5,000 here, and 5,000 is below 9,000. Our margin call is going to say, add money enough to bring your account balance back to 12,000. And in order to bring your account balance back to 12,000 from 9,000, you will need to put up 7,000, right? So the 7,000 will be injected there into your account, and in order to bring back your account balance to the 12,000 that you needed. So the 7,000 that you would add to your account is what we refer to as variation margin. Our initial margin will be the 12,000. The maintenance margin is going to be the 9,000. That is, you cannot go below 9,000. And if you ever go below 9,000, we'll see, okay, where are you below 9,000? You are 5,000. Okay, so add back 7,000 to bring you back to 12,000. And the 7,000 that you're adding back is your variation margin. And that happens over a period of time. And this is what the possible outcomes are going to look like. Let's say the contract is open on the first day, so the trading price or the futures price is going to be at 12.50, right? And we, on that first day, we have an initial margin of 12,000. That was 6,000 per contract. We had 2 contracts, that's 12,000. Well, at the end of the first day, we have a settlement price, and the settlement price here is the closing price of on the line at the end of that day. So at the end of that day, the price is at 8,241. Well, what does that mean? It means that since we initiated the contract from the first day to the second day, we've essentially had a loss. And what is that loss for? Well, from 12.50 to 12.41, we've lost about $9 per ounces. And remember, we have 200 ounces, so $9 times 200, and that's what gives us 1,800. And that is the 1,800 loss that we're recording here as negative value. So we've lost $9 here. That's the difference between 12.50 and 12.41 per ounce. And because we have 200 ounces, we position has essentially lost 1800. Now we've lost 1800. What happens? Well, if you recall our map here on our board, we lose 1800. What does that mean? It means that the margin account of the long party, so the long is going to have a margin account, and the short is also going to have a margin account. Both accounts have 12,000 built in them. At the end of the first day, we lost 1800. So 1800 are going to be debited from the long, because the long is losing 1800, and credited into the short. So the short balance is going to end at 12 or 13,800, right? Because we add 1,000 to 800 to the 12,000. So we remove 1800 here, and we add 1800 to the short party. That's what that means. So at the end, because we remove 1800 from the long account balance, the account balance of the long is going to end up at 10,200. At the end of the second day, the settlement price is at 1,238. Well, at 1,238, we've lost some more. And what we have lost is essentially a total of $500.40. Remember, we've lost this much, the difference between these two, per contract, and we have 200 contract. That brings us to a balance of 540. Now the difference between the two here, I believe, is about 2.7. So that's going to be $2.7 per contract times 200. That's how we get the 540. Now, cumulatively, over these 2 days, how much have we lost? The sum of these two is what we get here as the $2,340. So cumulatively, we've essentially lost $2,340 overall. So if we lost $2,340, so an extra 540 is going to be debited from the long, because we've still lost some more money here. An extra 240 is going to go from the long to the short, and it's going to add to the amount that the short has here, and that amount will be in addition to the $540. So ultimately, the long party's account balance is going to be at 9,660. So it's going to be 9,660. That's where we would be after we've removed the 1,800, first 1,800 at the end of the first day, and the 540 at the end of the second day. Now that happens over a few days. You remember that we have a maintenance margin. Our maintenance margin was at 9,000. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, this is 9,000 here. 9,000, I don't see, no, you can see that. I'm going to use a different color. This is 9,000 here. You cannot go below 9,000. And so it turns out that on this 7th day, we are losing an extra 1,260. That's going to be 1,260. And so cumulatively, since the beginning, we've lost a total of 4,020, which means that our account balance is now at 7,980. At this point, we are at 7,980, so we are somewhere here, 7,980, and that is below our maintenance margin. What that's going to do is it's going to trigger a margin call, and the margin call is going to go, how much does it need to add to the balance, which is 7,980, in order to bring it back to the initial margin, which is 12,000, and that amount is 4,020. And so the margin call is going to be for you to inject an extra $4,020 into the margin account. That $4,020 that's added is our variation margin. And that's an example here. Okay, so a couple of points about futures contract. Essentially, we know that futures contracts are settled daily, and the margin transaction that we described in the previous slide there describe what that process is. It's at the end of every day, profits and losses are essentially recorded and accounted for in order to reduce the risk of default from either party, the long or the short. futures prices, the closing out a futures position is easy, and it involves entering into an offsetting trade. Now, when you think about it, this is what we have. Remember that with the futures contract, because they trade on the exchange, your transaction as the trader are with the exchange. And so what we're going to have, I think we have a picture of that sometime later. What we're going to have is an investor here that enters into a long position with the exchange, and the exchange enter into another long position with another investor. And so this investor is a short for the exchange, and the exchange is a short for you, the investor. And so because the contracts are standardized, there may be several of the same contracts that are entered into by many counterparties, that by many other investors. And so for you to close out your position here is simply for you to take an offsetting position. And so the way you take the offsetting position is, if this is a long position that you have taken with the exchange, you would essentially take another short position with the exchange on the same underlying for a given price, and those are going to cancel each other. And then because you take a short position with the exchange is going to open another position with another third party, and that's how your position here is canceled, is offset. All right, most contracts here are closed out before maturity, and we talked about those. And the reason they're closed out before maturity is because of the difficulty sometimes to take delivery of the underlying. And so you might as well get the position netted at the end of the period, and then use the cash to purchase the underlying at the current market value. That is typically true for commodities contract or contracts on commodities. For financial futures, the transaction are closed, and those are essentially netted in cash, right? So there is a cash transaction that occurs at expiration of the contract. So they get to maturity, and it's a cash transaction that occurs there. Most of the time, the commodities contracts are reversed or closed or offset before maturity. Now let's talk a little bit about exchanges. We've talked and mentioned quite a bit so far that exchanges play an important role. And what are those? How does exchange work here? So the exchange functions as a clearinghouse for both the long and the short party on every single one of those contracts. The exchange clearinghouse has members, and so the participant in the exchange, the limited participant, generally they're large financial institution, and these members provide an initial margin and daily variation margin. So with the exchange, the members of the exchange are not required to have, there's no maintenance margin essentially. There's no maintenance margin. So at the end of every day, the members are required to post variation margin in order to bring their account back to initial margin. So there is no maintenance margin for members. Their account always has to be at initial margin. They may have intraday variation margin. So if within the day the exchange says that the account balance of the members has reduced quite a bit, and the exchange may ask within the day, before we even get to the end of the day, within the day, that the members provide intraday variation margin in order to bring the account back to initial margin. So the relationship between member of the exchange and the exchange does not involve any maintenance margin. It's only initial margin and variation margin. So that account has to be at initial margin at all times. However, the relationship between the broker and the member requires maintenance margin and variation margin. So the brokers who are not, if a broker is not a member, that broker must channel the transaction through the member. And if the broker is a member, the retail investors that have an account with the broker would have both initial margin and maintenance margin. And if maintenance margin is breached, then variation margin kicks in. The member will then require a margin from the broker, right? So if the broker is not a member of the exchange, the broker is going to route or channel its business through a member, and the broker will therefore post a margin with the member, and the member is going to have a margin account with the exchange. Now, as a retail investor, you're also going to have a margin account with your broker. So the transactions are going to look something like this when future prices of the underlying are increasing. And so if the future price of the underlying ST is greater than the forward price, let's call that forward price F0, what we're going to happen is the long party may be essentially would have maybe purchasing at a cheaper price and turning around and selling at a higher price. So the long party stands to benefit from this transaction. What that simply means is that for the purpose of margin, what we're going to have is a flow that goes from the short trader to the long trader. And the way it's going to happen is that the short trader is essentially going to post margin with the broker, and the broker is going to post margin to the clearinghouse. That is, if the broker is not a member of the clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse, the member is going to post margin with the clearinghouse. That margin is then going to be credited into the members that represents the long trader, and so on and so forth, and trickle down all the way to the initial to the long trader. Now what I'm going to do is on the next slide, actually it's still the next slide. On the next slide, what we have here is a flow that goes in the opposite direction essentially. And in going in the opposite direction, what we have is we have a scenario where future prices are going to be decreasing, and if they are decreasing, what we are going to observe is the opposite of what we had earlier, right? So the short trader will start to benefit from the transaction. So the margin is going to go from the long trader to the long trader's margin account with the broker. It's going to go from the brokers to the broker's margin account with the clearinghouse member, and go from the clearinghouse member at the end of the day or intraday to its margin account with the clearinghouse. So in both scenarios that we have here, what we're going to have is a trader that has a margin account with the broker has a margin account with the clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse has a margin account with the clearinghouse member, and the clearinghouse member has a margin account with the clearinghouse. And the same happens here. And so the short trader is going to deposit money into its margin account, and if the position is done to the benefit of the long trader, that money is going to go from this margin account to that margin account that the broker has with the clearinghouse member, and from this margin account to that margin account, and from that to that point, and so on and so forth. And that's what we're observing here. Now, what happens if it turns out that when the short trader a balance of the short trader's account gets deposited into the long trader's account? Well, if the long trader's account exceeds the initial margin, the long trader has the right to withdraw the excess over and bring it back into his or her own account. That is up to the long trader, or the long trader might want to leave that with the broker. And so the same happens in the scenario where the short trader stands to benefit from the transaction, and so it's going to go the other way. And remember that the long trader has a margin account. They all have a margin account here, and the member has a margin account. They have a margin account, and so on and so forth. And there's a margin account there. All right. What I want to do next is briefly talk about the OTC market. For so far, we've been looking at futures contract, and we've been looking at how it is that the clearinghouse serves as the middleman for futures contract. Forward contracts are traded on exchanges, and so the are traded over the counter, not on exchanges. And so the over the counter market reflects that bilateral clearing. That is in contrast to the central counterparty that we have with respect to the futures contract, right? The clearinghouse. And so bilateral clearing, at least that's what it used to be before the 2008 financial crisis, and then when we observed some new regulations. But bilateral clearing essentially says that the transaction occurs between two parties. So we have two financial institutions that directly enter into an agreement with each other, where there is no middleman, right? And the middleman that we observe with futures contract is essentially the clearing house. So with the OTC market, there's essentially no clearinghouse. At least there used to be no clearinghouse. Now the regulation has changed a lot of that. Now, in these bilateral agreements, transactions are governed by a master agreement, and that master agreement is typically the ISDA master agreement. And the ISDA, let me write this, stands for International Swaps and Derivative Association. So that is the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. Now, these master agreements come with a credit support annex, and this is a CSA. And this credit support annex defines the collateral that has to be posted by each side. So in this case, when it used to be that we had the bilateral agreement, and because there's no middleman, there's no margin account. And so to make sure that forward contracts functions exactly like futures contract, in that there is no initial transaction, there's nothing that happens today, the transaction is going to happen at some point in the future. And so to ensure that transaction is going to happen at some point in the future, both parties have to put up what we refer to as collateral. Now, these collateral are described by the credit support annex, or the CSA document. And that CSA, that collateral is really nothing else but cash collateral, which, when you think about it, a cash collateral is a margin. So it is simply another name for margin when it comes to forward contracts. Now, interest rates are paid on this cash collateral, right? So it is not really a cost to both parties, but because interests are paid on those cash collateral that are deposited by each side. And so after the 2007 financial crisis, following the 2007 financial crisis, there has been a requirement for all the standardized OTC derivatives transaction between the large financial institution to be cleared centrally, right, through a clearinghouse. And that clearinghouse is often known as the central counterparty. So that clearinghouse is where the CSAs are going to be, or the collaterals are going to be deposited. Those cash collateral that both financial institutions are going to be, those two financial institutions are going to be depositing, those collateral are going to be housed at the central counterparty. And the central counterparty are going to operate in a manner that's very similar to the exchange, right? So the operations of the central counterparty is going to be very similar to the exchange clearinghouse. So the exchange clearinghouse is the middleman between the two traders or two clearinghouse members, essentially. And both clearinghouse members engage in transaction with the exchange, and the exchange essentially takes the opposite transaction to each one of them. The central counterparty, which is the official name of the clearinghouse for the forward market, not the futures market, is the middleman for those financial institutions also. The central clearing counterparty has members just like the exchange has, and those members provide an initial margin based on the outstanding contracts with the central counterparty. So the initial margin is a function of their own outstanding contract, and the members also have to provide variation margin the same way the members of the exchange have to provide variation margin. Now, if a trader is not or a broker is not a member of the central counterparty, a company, it can clear transaction through a member, right? So if you're not a member, you have to go through a member, just like if a broker is not a member of a clearinghouse, they have to go through a member of a clearinghouse in order to have the transaction occur. So the difference between the bilateral agreement and the central clearing is something like this. So bilaterally, the transactions were entered one-on-one. So the transactions were entered into individually. So this investor or this trader here would enter into different agreement with all of these parties, and say this other trader would enter in different agreements with all of these parties that we have here. Right, and so there are transactions that are entered into individually, no middleman. Now that creates a scenario where there is systemic risk, but there's very little clarity on with respect to how many transactions really exist out there on those future forward contracts, and how risky are those transactions essentially. The imposition of the central counterparties in forward markets requires that those transactions go through the central counterparty. That reduces the this volume of individual transactions that the members had with each other, to a limited number of transactions that all go through the central counterparty, and provides a lot more visibility on what that systemic risk can be and how to manage the systemic risk. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for this video, and when we come back in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this up and talk about some terminology, have a further discussion on futures and forward, and how it is that and have a quick summary of how it is that they're similar and how it is that they differ. Okay, I'll see you in the next video for just that.